Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Fong would like to mark the exhibit that she took the witnesses to yesterday, and then she'll be followed by Brenda Gartner, who will commence cross-examination. Mr. Lowe's has advised he will not be asking any questions of these witnesses.
Mr. Commissioner, Lisa Fong for Heiltsuk Tribal Council. Yesterday I referred to the IFMP for the North, the June 2010 to May 31st, 2011. I would ask that it be marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 349.
Thank you.
Ms. Fong, that exhibit, that document you mentioned was, at least the one you had was, or the one that we have on the screen is draft 1, I believe.
We now, overnight, we corrected that and we provided the final version of this document to Mr. Lund. So now we are marking the one that I had before me, which has the same language as the language which I referred to yesterday in draft 1.
So I'm sorry, what exhibit number is that? 349. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. It's Brenda Gartner for the First Nations Coalition, and with me is Leah Pence. I just want to start, good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Thanks for being here. And just wanted to start with two clarifications, perhaps. One is that my instructions for my clients is to try to use this process as best as we can to elicit information towards the recommendations that we're seeking, and not so much to cross-examine you. I would prefer to think that I'm asking you a few questions and seeing whether we could work together to elicit information that the Commissioner may need for his recommendations. And so I want to advise the Commissioner that I'm going to cover 3 areas in my questions this morning. One is an overview, strategic questions regarding the engagement process and decision-making structures for harvest management issues, particularly as it relates to First Nations and DFO. And I think most of these questions will be directed to Mr. Rosenberger to start with. And then I'm going to move to questions around the FRIMPT and the salmon team and the salmon working group, and just get some clarity around how those 3 different internal organizations work. And then I've got some specific questions on the IHPC and some specific questions on the Fraser River panel. And so I'm just going to cover those areas this morning in my questions. I understand we're going to get into quite a bit more detail in the coming weeks around things like the forum and the roadmap and all of that. So I know that there's always an intermingling and things are a bit circular on some of this stuff, but I'm going to try to leave those questions till another day. As an entranceway into my strategic level questions, I thought I'd begin by sharing with you that so far, and these are questions for you, Mr. Rosenberger, so far in the testimony that has been provided by Sue Farlinger and Paul Sprout, and I can take you to it if you want to see the actual words, but they've been able to confirm for Commissioner Cohen that developing a clearly mandated Tier 1, 2, and 3 process with multi-year funding would be helpful to DFO in the management of Fraser River salmon sockeye. And so my question for you, Mr. Rosenberger, from your experience is, do you agree also that a mandated, transparent Tier 1, 2, and 3 process that would enable First Nations and DFO to meaningfully engage on harvest management issues would be helpful?
Yes, I do.
And in addition, I take it from the evidence provided by Mr. Sprout that linear approach to Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, which First Nations often pursue, is something a bit challenging for DFO, in particular that the Tier 3 processes are often needed before the Tier 1 and 2 are in place. Would you agree with me on that?
I think much of it occurs at the same time, and they're not always in the clear linear progression in trying to deal with some of the given issues, with all the groups. But we do try to keep them flowing where we are preparing materials that we're trying to give out in that more linear fashion. But I think there's definitely struggles in trying to make that happen.
One of the things Mr. Sprout spoke to, and I wonder if you could comment on, is the challenges of the technical challenges associated that are necessary in Tier 3. If those aren't in place, that becomes a difficulty. Would you agree with me on that?
It can be, yes.
The next area that, again, on the strategic level, that I spoke to Mark Saunders about when talking about the wild salmon policy implementation was agreeing also that in implementation of that policy, the mandated 1, 2, and 3 tier process would be useful. He went on one step further, and we began to talk about scale-based analysis. And by that, I think we mean understanding clearly what types of discussions need to happen where amongst tier 1 and 2 in particular, and then tier 3. Would you also agree that in the harvest management work and the harvest management decisions, having that kind of scale-based analysis would be useful to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
Yes, I do.
And then would you agree that implementing a Fraser River watershed process, in particular a forum that engages particularly as it relates to both the approach and the in-river, would be particularly useful for discussions such as escapement and the interaction of harvest management plans?
Might have missed that a little bit. So if you could ask the question again, please.
Sure. Sorry, I might be putting too many things in my question. Let's try it again. Would you agree that implementing a tier 1 and 2 process, first of all, at the Fraser River watershed level, would be useful for such things as discussions on escapement and the interaction amongst fishing harvesting plans?
Yes.
And would it assist in streamlining and providing meaningful participation in season?
I think the participation and the roles that the various parties bring to each of those levels right now has been an issue that needs more focus to try to streamline. So that's that people are mandated and representatives as opposed to observers or representing themselves and not necessarily representing a given geographic area.
And perhaps that will help me, because what I wanted to do now is those questions are matters and issues that the department has been familiar with for a number of years. Do you
That's
agree?
correct. Yes.
And there's been some challenges in implementing those tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 processes. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes, I would.
And I've done my best to provide a kind of listing of the types of challenges, and I'm wondering if you'll comment on them and whether they would be helpful. So first of all, there's been historical challenges in developing the tier 1 process because there have been some tribes that are groupings that have been unwilling to access capacity dollars through DFO's AFS programs or AROM programs. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes.
And that's resulted in some First Nations having less capacity than others, and some First Nations having weaker working relationships with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Would you agree with me on that?
Yes.
Would you also agree that it's also increased the distrust that occurs between the First Nations and with DFO?
Yes, I think so.
Another challenge that I'm wondering if you could comment on is that it's possible that not only do you have challenges understanding who's mandated and who's not mandated to come to those meetings. That's what you were just talking about earlier. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is it fair to say that First Nations also expressed to you and raised concerns about not being absolutely clear what the purpose of a meeting is and what the implications of their participation might be in that meeting?
That's raised at times, and we spend a fair amount of time at some meetings trying to make sure that it is clear. And one of the objectives that we've had, in particular for the last 2 years, is trying to make sure those objectives are clear going into the process. So that's why we've set up steering committees, whatever the name are. There's various names around them, but the forum has a formalized process that works on specifically that, the objectives meeting by meeting. So that at the tier 2 level, I think much more of that is, and the broader forum level has been corrected, but on some of the bilateral type meetings, I think it's a large number of issues often come into a given meeting, and so the clarity around the objectives and expectations is still an issue.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm glad to hear that things are improving. Can I also ask, is it part of it is it that it isn't clear whether the meeting is for engagement, the exchange of information, or that it's actually a meeting that some might consider consultation against and have some implications as it relates to title and rights? Is that one of the difficulties and challenges?
The interpretation of it. I think the department's tried to be clear in its objectives and the acceptance of whether something forms part of the consultation process or not is still an issue.
And one of the things going forward that will become useful when we can get there is potentially developing consultative processes that everybody's clear about. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Again, another challenge that I'm wondering if you can speak to and perhaps provide a little bit of examples. I know Commissioner Cohen has heard this a bit before, and I expect that you've lived this, Mr. Rosenberger, a little bit, is the difference in how decision-making is made in the Aboriginal communities as compared to in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and that inverted pyramid that we often see, where decisions in the First Nations are most often made, particularly harvest decisions and decisions are very close to the ground, very close to home in the regional areas, and decisions by DFO, particularly contentious issues on those matters, are often made very high in your pyramid, quite far away from the ground. And so I wonder if you could comment on that and comment on the kinds of challenges that provides to the interaction between First Nations and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
An example of some of that, I guess, is when we hold meetings, in particular on the Tier 2 level, but at a bilateral process, you often do not have chiefs or necessarily a mandated councillor with a fisheries portfolio at the session, and you have a relatively large number of people that are members of a given First Nation or groups of First Nations giving their views on how something might on a given action that might be moving forward, and they're not necessarily looking at it in the same way. So from the First Nation side, trying to get to a collective view, a single view, is one of the issues that we're not always certain about whose view is it from in that room we should be taking back into the department side. You're correct in that from our side of it, we do have a hierarchy of decisions, and we don't set escapement goals on a bilateral meeting in a given room that affects a larger group of First Nations because those fish migrate through other areas and things like that. And so that's an example where local First Nations have a very hard time that the department won't come to that decision rule with them in a given meeting in a specific geographic area, in particular in a terminal area where their view is that they hold that decision right in their system, and from our side of it, we're trying to accomplish that at a broader scale.
Thank you, that's very helpful. It probably leads right into this next one. Would you also agree and perhaps comment on the challenges associated with DFO playing a dispute resolution role amongst First Nations and sometimes perceived as resolving disputes between First Nations and other stakeholders, and challenges associated with that?
Well, I think that's a key issue that is part of the struggle. So, using the example I just did with the escapement side of things, it's a few years back now, but we tried to get input into escapement objectives for the early steward, for example, and in this particular given year, we had received advice. Some of this was in writing, some of it was verbally in meetings. But the escapement objective ranged from 1,500 sockeye to over 200,000 sockeye, or it might have been 200,000. And each one of those groups then wanted to have a fishing plan established based on their input into that escapement objective. And so the department selected a number for given reasons in that given circumstance. But that's an example of where things were really struggling for us as being the arbitrator in the various advice, and so that's why we're trying to move towards forum type meetings where we get a broad range of First Nations over a large geographic area and try to get to hopefully a consensus decision from their part, but if not, at least they understand some of the trade-offs, and they have been trying to make those kinds of adjustments, in particular in the last few years.
Is it fair to say that some of the First Nations who had not been participating at a watershed level basis are still not participating in the forum? Are you still struggling with those issues?
We still have individual groups that we have very little contact with and are not part of the forum process at all.
Some of which take off a fair bit of regional or geographic area along the Fraser. For example, the Lahakmuk or the Stadlium are Middle Fraser people, and generally are they participating at the forum levels?
We have participation from the Nlakatma and Stadlium, if I've said, and working on the same people.
Yeah.
We don't have people from every First Nation within the group, so you hope that there's some dialogue going on in their groups. But again, that's what we struggle with is, if you have somebody there, are they representing, we have one chief from the Inlet Catman that shows up regularly, but is he representing all the Inlet Catman or not? My view is he's not, and he often states that he's not. He states he's representing a number of them. So that kind of interaction is part of the issue. I would say we have the majority of people showing up, and it's a lot of the smaller, in the broader tribal groupings, it's a lot of the small independent bands that have really not started to engage.
One further item I've identified, I'm wondering if you could comment on. I haven't had a chance to ask Mr. Sprout questions on this yet. My examination or my questions of him have not proceeded yet. But he mentioned in what he described, I think I have his words right, the existence of undefined title and rights and the challenges associated with that. Would you agree that that is a challenge also for the dialogues you have with First Nations and the outcome at these meetings?
It's significant.
And I wonder if you could help me. I've been thinking about those words and thinking about that challenge, as you know. What's the part that's undefined that's the most difficult? Is it the location of the rights, or is it who the rights holders are, or is it the content of the rights? And in particular, is it something like the content of the co-management right?
It's probably all of those. And we have we have significant overlap in claimed territories between groups. Some of them that are very broad and multiple different groups claiming the same area and looking for the co-management right and the say in defining fishing objectives or escapement objectives, things like that. The specific right itself, and then moving into co-management, I think, is one where some of the First Nations, I think, are still trying to think about how bringing their context of that management into trying to match with what the government is trying to do, because they're not necessarily consistent, even thought processes about how we're moving forward.
Thank you. Are there any other challenges? Those are the ones that I had done some work on. Are there any other ones that come to your mind that I might not have missed?
I think you hit the significant ones.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions at the strategic level. I'm just wondering, when you dream about a watershed program or a watershed process that might work for both First Nations and DFO and the other stakeholders that you work with, I wonder if you would agree with me that these would be benefits into moving that dream forward. First of all, a dedicated multi-year resource base from which First Nations and DFO could rely upon to obtain this goal.
Yes, I think that would be useful.
Would it also be useful to get a commitment from both DFO and the First Nations to dedicate the human resources necessary to accomplish this overarching task? My observation is that often there are so many in-season and post-season and all of those other types of tasks that the task of structuring the processes are fit into the cracks. Would you agree with that? And would that be useful to have a dedicated group of people from both DFO and the First Nations that could concentrate on this task?
It would. That's a key part of what we're trying to do in the roadmap process.
And I wondered, you were either a participant or a good observer, a close observer of the effort that went on under the development of the wild salmon policy. Is that correct?
That's fair to say.
And that was a pretty, I'm going to use magical time in which there was a fair bit of work done and achieved over a short period of time relative to some of the tasks we have on the fisheries. Would you agree with that?
I think that's, yeah, that's a good way to describe it, yes.
And one of the things Commissioner Cohen's already heard with respect to that process is how useful it was to have senior people at Department of Fisheries and Oceans and senior people within First Nations that were really willing to grasp that and had timelines and had commitments that had to be made. Would that be a useful thing when you look at the struggles and the challenges we've had with respect to the watershed process?
It would.
Are there any other challenges or possible solutions that you've thought about over the years that you've been working on this issue, Mr. Rosenberger?
I think one of the keys is this work with bringing the forum together, at least in the South Coast in the last few years, is really trying to get that broader participation in the same room. it's been interesting to observe, but not unexpected. I think the challenges of coastal First Nations that have much more of a commercial history interest versus in recent times versus the interior First Nations and really the whole Fraser, where they for many years did not have a commercial interest, and trying to reconcile that and what they want to bring forward. And in the last couple of years, I think we're seeing a change in it and a shift of some of the objectives of some of the groups as they understand each other's and bring that into this broader management concept. I think we're seeing a shift in some places. So I think those kinds of processes and engagements is the key factor moving forward, one of them.
So maybe if I've just heard part of that correctly, and we're going to touch on this later on the challenges of terminal fisheries, but one of the other benefits of this approach watershed work is that as we change where and how we fish and for what purposes, there may be more consensus built around that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Last week and again yesterday, I heard you mention, and it always seems like a whole lot when we hear these numbers, 40 to 60 meetings that need to go on a regular basis with First Nations. Am I correct to understand that for the most part, these are meetings that are being held by First Nations and area staff? And we don't have 40 and 60 meetings at the forum level, of course.
That's correct.
So it's at the area staff. And what processes does DFO use to make sure that the information that's collected at the area staff gets communicated up the line within DFO, and where decisions around some of those key harvesting issues are made?
Well, through the Fraser Integrated Management Team, we have the resource managers from each of the geographic areas is a part of that process. So they're bringing forward the information and comments, recommendations, whatever that are heard in each of their bilateral sessions. We have a tracking system in place when we get formal letters from any of the groups, trying to make sure that the local managers have the information they need to respond, or if it's an issue that we think should be elevated in the response. So that's something that the salmon coordinator position and myself have been working to coordinate on responses and letters to make sure that we're consistent in the information, and that also gives us the opportunity to see all of that information direct. The managers participate in their own processes within areas, so the individual resource managers are working with their chief of resource management, so it's from the 3 geographic zones that the department has, so BC Interior, Lower Fraser and South Coast. So there's an exchange of information and the issues, and so I think from our side of it, both in providing the direction down from the FREMP membership being listening in on Fraser panel meetings, listening in at our FREMP meetings, and the direction, the coordination, and developing lists of issues and options for how we're moving forward, so that they can go back out and try to resolve those at local levels. I think gives us that coordination that we need.
And without, again, taking away from the details, which we'll have now, I just want to see if I've heard that right, which is that it has a lot to do with who and how people are talking to each other.
Yes.
Last week and again yesterday, I understood from your evidence that another challenge, or maybe challenge is the right word, is that many First Nations do not have treaties. And from your experience and your perspective on the hard issues that you're dealing with in season and as it relates to harvest management, do we need treaties to resolve First Nations participation in Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 processes?
I think it's the treaties gives you the defining of the rights. So what the process is that the government wants to come to, and the First Nations, there is a First Nations treaty process. So that's obviously one way of doing it. But governments have made other arrangements to define, whether they're trying to define the rights or they're just trying to define, given set of circumstances. And in the interior, we're seeing that around forestry right now in some places without treaties. So there are mechanisms for settling this without a specific land claim treaty, but until you get into defining come into agreement either on that right or how that right will be enacted until there's a treaty or whatever those, the more formalized process is. I think that's a key part on trying to understand how to move forward.
So it's really understanding the nature of the rights that people are responsible for more than the treaty.
Yes.
Thank you. And would you also agree that in the modern day issues, in particular the challenges around sharing arrangements in times of scarcity and approaches to selective and terminal fisheries, some of the conservation issues that you're looking at, that we really can't wait for treaty, given that many First Nations along the Fraser are not even in the treaty process? Would that be a fair, do you agree with that?
I think we need to resolve those issues, and the fish don't wait, as we often say, to have all this other more formalized agreements concluded. So we have to have some kind of arrangements each year, and that's what we strive for right now.
Thank you. I've heard that expression quite often, so I'm glad that it's now on the record. I wanted now to pick up on something that I understand was raised yesterday in your testimony. I just need a couple of clarifications. I wasn't sure I understood this. I understand in response to questions from Ms. Fong that you use the term mandate information. And without the benefit of the transcript, I just want to see if I've got a couple things correctly, and then I've got a couple of questions for you around this. I understood that you have a mandate for each First Nation. Is that each band?
Not necessarily at that level, no.
So some of them are tribal mandates and some of them are local individual First Nations, depending on how the agreements are crafted?
That's correct.
Thank you. And that the mandate is information that you've received from Ottawa, is that correct? Or is
That's correct.
So is the region involved in developing these mandates?
I assume so. I'm not part of that.
Oh, you're not part of that? Okay. And then who is part of that?
Our Treaty and Aboriginal Policy Group with the Ottawa people.
With the Ottawa people in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans?
That's right.
And who would that be in DFO here now? Like at a regional level, who?
Our Director of Treaty and Aboriginal Policy Division.
Could you tell me the name?
Karina McGivney was there. That's her substantive. Jennifer Nieder?
Sarah Murdoch is currently
Sarah's
acting in that position.
Thank you. Thanks. Now, these are mandates that inform the nature of the work that you do or the nature of the work that the area directors will do in any given season. And I appreciate that I'm not going to ask you the content of any particular mandate, so you can rest assured on that. But I am curious as to what they are. Are they mandates for FSC allocations? Are they mandates for economic fisheries? Are they mandates for how far and to what extent a First Nation can participate in decision-making structures? What type of mandates are we talking about?
Funding and FSC allocations.
Thank you. Do you know whether in developing these or in your own work, maybe that might be more easier for you to answer, but if you know from both perspectives in the development of the mandates in your own work, do you do strength of claim analysis with respect to the First Nations along the Fraser or the approach? Or is that part of the work that the department does?
It's considered in the work that we do.
And is that work shared with First Nations when you complete that work?
I don't think there's a lot of formalized work around it. I mean, from our side of it, it's often some groups have sent us maps or geographic descriptions of the areas that they're laying claim to. If where there's overlaps in those groups, then we need to understand that there might be more than one group in a given area, things like that. I can't say it at the area level, and I'm not even certain in the department. We do a lot of formalized work to conclude a strength of claim. I think from our side of it, it's been more the history of our interactions and which groups we would expect. And there has been a number of issues raised between some groups, and so in some of those we've been involved to try to either clarify or understand so some of the boundaries in some of the geographic areas. And in some places it's ended up where we've got consistent information on a communal license, for example, in the Williams Lake area between the Chilcotin and Alkali, the Sket First Nation, and the Northern Shuswap, for example, where they're claiming on, each one of them claims is their own, but they recognize some degree of overlap. So in places like that, we come to, some compromise in how we issue out communal licenses, for example.
Primarily, you're looking at strength of claim analysis to address what I often call shared use areas. Is that correct? Or overlap areas, to use your words?
That would be the use that we would probably have the most from fisheries management side of it.
So you don't really use strength of claim analysis to look at making decisions around harvesting and priority issues?
The priority side of things is one that we're actually most often asking the First Nations to try to work their way through, as I was talking about when we had multiple groups wanting different escapement levels, for example, on a given stock. So instead of us making that decision in favor of one group or another and stating that we think that one group or another has a higher priority or claim, we haven't made those kinds of determinations. So we're looking at processes to try to resolve on a management basis, not on a strength of claim basis.
Thank you. I wonder, do you know whether or not any of this mandate information is going to be disclosed to this commission as part of the disclosure of documents?
I have no idea.
I'm going to turn now my questions to trying to understand a little bit more how FRIMP and the Salmon Working Group and the Salmon Salmon Team. There's three internal DFO groups that we've learned about: the FRIMP and the Salmon Working Group and the Salmon Team. Frankly, I looked at the terms of reference that I could find, and I'm still I still have a couple questions about how their work coordinates. And could you tell me, is one working for another group, or is the Salmon Working Group working for the Salmon Team and doing the legwork for them, or how do the three of them work?
I'm sure Jeff will jump in here, but maybe just at the level I would describe it is the Salmon Team is a geographic working, or it's a working team within our department, but it's a group of people. So it's the same as I'm the director for the BC Interior, so you could call us the BC Interior Team. Idea that that's a work structure group. The ones that actually are working on fisheries decisions in a formalized team is trying to bring people together from across sectors or across geographic working units within the department, is the Salmon Working Group and the Fraser Integrated Management Team. So they have a specific management task that they're trying to do where there is a terms of reference. And the Salmon Team, as it's been described around here, is really a group of people that's it's our core headquarters geographic working people.
Great, that's very helpful. So they're sort of think tank people, and the FRIMP and the Salmon Working Group are people that are sorry, I don't mean to any insult on that. Are people that are charged with making certain decisions and certain recommendations.
Well, the salmon people who work in, Jeff and the Salmon Team lead and the Salmon Officer are charged with making decisions as well, but they sit on this integrated teams, the other two, versus, having an organization structure is how I would describe the Salmon Team.
You'll appreciate that one of the reasons why I'm asking these questions is it's often hard to understand at what level and who makes certain decisions within the department. You'll agree with me that that's sometimes a challenge First Nations have, and perhaps even some people in the department have.
There's often questions raised, so I think we try to answer them. Yeah. We'll try today.
Okay, thank you. Is it the FRIMP or the Salmon Working Group that finalizes the IFMP for sign-off for the RDG?
Well, Jeff gets that together in his role as that's one of his tasks as a lead within the Salmon Team side of this. So that's a structure part, but there's a lot of people who feed into the development of the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, and it's not specifically from either FRIMP or the Salmon Working Group.
Jeff, is there anything you'd like to add with that?
I could maybe just add a little bit. So Barry's right. I have the ultimate responsibility for pulling together the final IFMPs that are going to go to the minister for approval, as well as the briefing note that's going to summarize the issues around those. We utilize any number of our teams that we have in place. We typically at the Salmon Working Group discuss issues related to the IFMP, where we can get feedback from all of the participants of the Salmon Working Group. One important distinction to make is that the salmon team and the salmon working group are focused broadly in the Pacific region, so it's not just Fraser sockeye and pink salmon, whereas that's more of a focus for the Fraser River Integrated Management Team.
That does help me, thank you. Now, is it then FRIMPT who takes the various competing potential interests, perhaps even something as loosely defined as the public interest and those types of things? Is it FRIMPT who does that final balance between those issues and makes decisions before they make the recommendations then?
For the IFMP development, it's the Jeff is coordinating that for the department from various sources that it's coming in. So the pre-season document that guides our in-season decisions, and the Fraser Integrated Management Team is taking that document and making those deliberations in season about the decisions. And as the chair of FRIMPT, that's a responsibility that I have.
And are there any direct engagement meetings between FRIMPT and First Nations on matters that you make decisions on either pre-season or post-season or in-season?
Well, members of FRIMPT would be doing bilateral consultations. They would attend forum processes, Integrated Harvest Planning Committee. So the FRIMPT as a whole group doesn't go out and travel to meet with all the groups in various geographic areas, but people from the FRIMPT team go to those meetings and bring that information back into the process.
So is it fair to say that there is often at that FRIMPT team differences of views and perspectives that need to be talked out as it relates to that? If I'm getting that right, if area directors are getting information into FRIMPT about the differing views that First Nations might have on the fishing plans, there may be conflicts associated with that or challenges associated with that. Are those issues talked out and talked through at the FRIMPT level?
That's correct.
And are there dispute resolution processes that are used by FRIMPT when doing that?
Not that we have a formal list out, here's the steps you follow, but the IFMP gives us direction. We have court case decisions on priority of the First Nations, the department's policies, besides the IFMP, the allocation policy, selective fishing policy. There's a number of different places that guide those decisions. So when recommendations are coming in from a geographic area or a given sector for fishing, that the DFO person who was at that meeting might be bringing into the discussion as a whole. In most cases, there is policy and direction that helps to work our way through. Where in places like First Nation sharing around a limited stock, we don't have clear. There isn't something, as we've already discussed, about saying that Group A has priority over Group B, that both have fish passing through their areas but not spawning there, or they spawn there versus passing through, kind of arguments that have been brought forward. In those cases, the department has set some rules that we're using and that we've passed on to First Nations, and if they come to consensus of a different set of rules, then we would look to incorporate those in our decisions.
Maybe if I could add as well to what Barry said, there are going to be occasions where there may not be agreement in the FRIMPT team on the particular approach, and an issue is going to be controversial no matter what the decision is going to be made. So in those sorts of cases, briefings can be done at the RDG to get feedback on what level of briefing we might want to do. And in some cases, for important decisions, we have taken the step of briefing up to the minister for a decision, and the decision on the cultus exploitation rate in 2010 was an example of that.
And do you also take it another step, which is to get back to the First Nations and advise them of the competing interests that you're having to balance and the nature of options that you're considering, and get feedback at that level? Or is it primarily through your own hierarchy?
Well, keeping with the example of cultus sockeye in 2010, we did make a number of efforts to try and go back and meet with Stalo and Suwali specifically. At the previous forum meetings in the pre-season planning, First Nations there suggested the department work closely with those two groups on any plans we were considering making with respect to cultus.
Rosenberger said earlier, is it fair to say that at the stage in which FRIMPT is making decisions, you're not considering strength of claim analysis or any issues around that? You're mainly dealing with the management issues?
Yeah, I think Barry's depiction of that was accurate from previous.
Is it also a fair observation that what DFO is trying to do internally with the potential challenges that associated and externally? Is it you're trying to work with committee levels internally to reach consensus on what can go forward? Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's fair.
And is it a fair observation that if you do reach consensus at these levels, that as they travel forward, your recommendations are usually respected? Is that correct? If you reach consensus at the FRIMP level, for example, and have consensus reached amongst the area directors or any of the other things and make those recommendations forward, do they generally get changed at a higher level, or are they generally implemented?
They're generally implemented.
Typically, how are the decisions of FRIMP communicated back to First Nations as it relates to harvest decisions and the DFO's decision? Is it usually through just the IFMP, or do you actually communicate directly? We've considered these 3 issues and we've decided to go with this, or how do you do it?
Anybody who writes to us, we write back and on their recommendations, and we provide the DFO decision and rationale if it's accepting it or if it's different, and why we might have made a change. In the discussions in our planning processes, the meeting that we'll be holding tomorrow with First Nations in the forum is one of the things that we do in our postseason reviews is get the recommendations from groups. And it's not just First Nations, but in this case, the ones that they've made, and we try to show where here's the decisions that the department has taken. Here's the recommendation or the series of recommendations we might have seen from First Nations on a given issue, and what we did in adopting it, and hopefully information on how successful it was in the implementation. So there's a number of different ways that information gets exchanged.
Thank you.
Maybe if I might add a little bit to what Barry said, in terms of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process, I quite often will go back to individual First Nations that have sent us letters with advice and ask if it's okay to share that information with broader groups. So to the extent that there's agreement on doing that, I provide a summary at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee on advice that we've been provided. I think on these sorts of questions, there's maybe things that we do differently in season as well, in terms of regular planning calls with the various groups to explain the information as it currently stands with the process, our understanding of what fishing plans are for various other groups. And so it's a much more dynamic process in season in terms of the department or other technical experts that are involved in the process. Mike Staley's a good example. He's got a weekly call for First Nations where he keeps them abreast of the information from the Fraser panel in season and any plans that are being considered. So from pre-season to in-season, we move to a much more dynamic process in season in terms of the updating we try and do.
Thank you. Just two final questions on FRIMP and how it works within the department. Is it FRIMP that would be the group that would recommend to you as the chair of the Fraser panel different approaches on engagement with First Nations? Is that, if I got that correct?
I think the approach to the interactions with First Nations is something that we discuss to some degree in FRIMP, but the given areas are often defining that for themselves in the workings that they have, like what might be working, and as you described earlier, some groups are further advanced technically, some are more interested in being engaged. So I think the method for engagement in a specific area is defined in the area, but whether the engagement has occurred or whether there's people who are indicated that not interested in meeting, so we understand at the FRIMP level if we want to make a decision that we have attempted to meet the consultation objectives is an example of something that we want to understand in the FRIMP process.
I guess I'm trying to get a sense of how you, as the chair of the Fraser panel, get some of your mandate issues. Are you mandated from FRIMP for the pre-season and in-season work that you do at the Fraser panel? Or directed? Maybe mandate is too strong a word. Do you get your direction from FRIMP as to the positions that are promoted by the department at the Fraser panel or otherwise?
Well, policy is giving me direction. I report to the Regional Director General as the area director and trying to implement the area mandate in the summer or year-round. I'm also report to the Chief Commissioner of the Pacific Salmon Commission as the panel chair, which is also the RDG, so that makes it easy. I don't have to track down 2 people. In the scheme of things, there's a lot of interaction there. I think there was a point that Jeff was clarifying in some of my discussions. So as the Fraser panel chair, I am mandated to make those decisions and with FRIMP for both the domestic side and the international issues. But it's it's not like I don't talk to the RDG on a regular basis about where we're going or what the issues might be if they are significant, and if there's any changes that we're considering.
Mr. Rosenberger, I know that you've had, correct me, you've had experience with the Fraser River panel much before you became the chair. You've been working with that group and active in that group for a while now?
Well, I was 7 or 8 years the co-chair for the Southern panel, so there's a fair number of links between the Southern panel and the Fraser River panel. Many of the fisheries in the areas are overlap. It's more of a species designation to the separation. I also was asked to participate as an observer in the Fraser River panel for a number of years before I was on the Southern panel for a few different reasons. So I've had knowledge of the Fraser panel for a long time.
Thank you. And I want to pick up on a comment. I think I've remembered it right. I didn't quite have a chance to go back to the transcript, but as I remember your evidence when Ms. Baker was asking you questions was around, you don't have to be a scientist always to be able to work with these numbers, and in fact that some of the job as a manager is to integrate and deal with the various uncertainties. Is that have I put words in your mouth, or?
Probably not.
It is your understanding and your work at the Fraser panel and your experience that there is increasing uncertainties and in-season risks as part of the work, in particular around run size estimates. And
I'm not necessarily agreeing that there's increasing uncertainties. I think we're spending more time on trying to document and understand the uncertainties and take that into account in our decisions more explicitly.
Oh, that's fantastic. I actually did a little bit of work having sat here to sort of list the kinds of uncertainties that you as managers may be facing in your decision-making process, and I'll see whether or not this is consistent with your work. First of all, you have uncertainties regarding the estimates of fish abundance and other measurements. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is there also uncertainties regarding the model structures themselves and then the parameters of how those models apply?
I'm not a modeler, so this is part of where you maybe don't have to be a scientist to be a part of this. Maybe to respond to in linking the first question into your second one is that, so the kinds of things we're doing within the Pacific Salmon Commission is asking them to develop a new model where they, in the past, we're using 3 or 4 different types of models to try to estimate the run size in season, and some of those had uncertainty estimations in association with them, and others did not. The new model, the intent there is to move into more of a different type of statistics and analysis, this Bayesian process, and part of that is to try to more quantify the various uncertainties in the different parts. But so the workings of the model, I don't have any information on it, on whether the model is more uncertain or less, but our objective in the panel and what we've asked the Salmon Commission to do is try to bring more pieces of information into there, quantifying the uncertainties or risks associated with various parts of that when they report out. Great.
And Commissioner Cohen does have an affidavit from the woman at the PSC that lists all the uncertainties that the models include. How about uncertainties regarding the response of the users to the regulations, like changes in gear type, changes in fishing efforts that occur as a result of the changes in the fishing season? Those are increasing, or some types of uncertainties that you as managers?
There's definitely uncertainties, but I'd say that that's one of the areas where it's probably less the fisheries themselves and the regulations. Moving to, for example, some of the individual transferable quotas and the accountabilities, but the accounting processes now where we have dockside monitoring, so it's virtually a full census on the program versus an estimation, what used to be largely described as a sample survey type of an estimation process. So I think we have less risk in the catch and the quantity of the catch. So the reliability and certainty around that is improved when you look at how many of those fisheries now have got a full census versus an estimation process around them. So, gear type use, I think there's been lots of information on the transition to selective fishing and the objectives around that. There's training courses and use and whatnot. So my understanding and my observations would be that some of those we have less, there's still uncertainty, but it would be less than it would have been in the past.
Great. That's helpful. There are also uncertainties around the future environmental conditions, both in terms of the ones that we're used to measuring, which is water levels and water temperatures, but also future environmental conditions associated with cumulative impacts. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I think that's significant.
Also uncertainties regarding the future social, political, and economic conditions that are associated with these fisheries. Is that correct?
It could be, yes.
And likely there's also uncertainties regarding future management objectives as it relates to some of these stocks. Is that correct?
Well, there's uncertainties because there's different objectives that different parties are bringing to the table, but I think the process is improving all the time of trying to get people to bring their issues to the table and trying to work through them and come to consensus as much as possible, but at least a clear understanding of what the objectives are. So I would say that in any given year, there's less uncertainty.
All right, so that actually takes me right to my next question. Would you agree with me that when working with all of these different uncertainties and that a person's responsibilities, their own experiences, their own values, their own risk tolerances, and familiarities with the interplay of all these will result in different reactions to these uncertainties and different responses to these uncertainties?
Yes.
And would you also agree with me that understanding the level of these uncertainties is as an increasing challenge, and getting adequate information around that is something that requires further work at the Fraser panel?
Yes.
Has there been formal approaches that are being developed at the Fraser panel amongst the managers as to how to approach these uncertainties? You mentioned a few things that you're taking at a specific level. Are there more collective efforts that are being made to deal with all of these uncertainties and how to work with them?
And that's part of, again, in the model where we're trying to quantify the uncertainties so people understand where decisions leave risk in the integrated fisheries, in the Fisheries model. That's built into some of this process. So I think there's a few places where we're trying to spend more time on trying to quantify the risk, trying to quantify the uncertainty and get input from people in that regard. So I think there is work going on in a few fronts, may not be in all of them.
If I could maybe just add briefly to what Barry said, there has been a fair amount of work done at the Fraser panel to try and assess risks of different fishing plans, for example, as well. And there was, I can't remember the exact years, but we were looking at the probabilities of exceeding cultus exploitation rate objectives, for example. And so we built new tools into the planning models to try and address some of that. I think you referred to Catherine Mickelson's as well earlier without using her name, and one of the pieces of information she's also been developing is probabilities of meeting the escapement targets given uncertainties on run size. So there's new information being brought into the discussions to address some of the questions and concerns that people are raising.
Thank you. Just picking up on that question around different people having different perspectives on these uncertainties, could you remind me, Mr. Rosenberger, I'm sorry, again, how many representatives on the Fraser panel do the commercial fisheries have?
7 or 8. 7 or 8.
And the recreational?
1.
And how many DFO reps sit at the?
2.
2. And how many from the First Nations?
3.
Isn't it 2 First Nations with alternates at the Fraser panel?
No, 3.
3?
There is only 6 members and there's 6 alternates, but
So you're counting all 12 there?
I'm counting all 12 in the process.
Thank you.
The 3 First Nations, there's an Upper Fraser, a Lower Fraser, and a Approach area.
And how long have these numbers been in place?
They've changed periodically. There was 2 First Nations for a long time. So to change to 3 would have been about 4 or 5 years ago. And 20 years ago there was only 1 First Nation, so there's a progression there, but I don't have the specific dates when we've made changes on who's members.
How are those changes made? Who makes that decision to change the makeup of the Fraser River panel?
Until about 4 or 5 years ago, it was at the decision of the minister, and now that decision resides in the region, and it's the Regional Director General that makes decisions on appointments to panels.
I am informed that at a meeting in February of 2009 of the First Nations Caucus of the Pacific Salmon Commission in Oregon, Mr. Sprout indicated that it was his personal opinion anyway that at least 50% of the representation on the Fraser panel should be First Nations. Were you at that meeting?
I was at that meeting, yes.
Do you agree with Mr. Sprout on this?
The discussion we had was that we needed to increase the participation of First Nations in both geographic areas, but also in the interests that they were bringing forward. So one of the members now is a commercial fisherman as well as a First Nation person, and so we looked at it in that context, and there was some debate in that meeting about when you started talking about percentages, which is maybe where that part came, of whether they were First Nations FSC type interests only. I haven't thought enough about whether it should be 50% and how you would make that relationship, but I do agree that there should be more First Nations on the panel.
And what are the impediments to increasing First Nations representation? Why hasn't it yet happened, and what needs to happen in order for that to occur?
Well, the RDG needs to make a decision, so somebody would have to be removed from the panel. Because when you're appointed, there's some of the appointments actually have a set term, and some of them don't. But you'd have to remove someone from a position and make an appointment to obviously somebody else. I think there's a few impediments. One is that the First Nations have still not collectively got themselves to the point where when somebody comes, they're there representing either a geographic area or some interest. Well, obviously they have an interest, but that we know that they're there mandated by some area that they're going back. So there's some issues around how First Nations people amongst themselves would want to have people appointed, and then the role that they would carry back. There's requests from, as we heard yesterday or one of the days I was here, there's requests from the Marine Conservation Caucus for formalized membership. There's been requests for additional recreational people to try to cover off their geographic interests. And I don't think there's any formal requests right now for increased commercial, but there's been letters and information on file that the commercial industry does not want to lose any of the seats that they have. So it's trying to weigh off the various interests that are interested in participating, and then within the groups of who should be selected and how they would come forward.
Do you agree with me that in order to get First Nations insight on the weighing of these uncertainties and the measuring of these uncertainties, you wouldn't necessarily need the mandate issue resolved? Is that correct? It'd be nice to have them both resolved, like the mandate on who they represent and whether they represent all First Nations on the Fraser. I've heard you say you'd like to have both of those in place, that would be useful. But you'd agree with me that in order to improve decisions at the Fraser River panel, just having the wisdom of different perspectives is a useful thing?
Yes.
And so that mandate issue may not need to be resolved in order to take the next step on that. Is that correct?
It may not be, but I think it's a significant issue in trying to get informed input.
Perhaps if we could have Exhibit 14 at page 282. Mr. Rosenberger, I'm asking them to bring up a summary of the recommendations that I have. Exhibit 14, page 282. And this was recommendation. You may be familiar with this recommendation, Mr. Rosenberger, from your own work. Again, it's a recommendation 44 from the Williams Inquiry. So you'll see on the left-hand side the actual recommendation, the PSC Fraser River Panel's critical link. The Canadian consultative and management structures for all fisheries impacting on Fraser sockeye should be integrated with the Canadian sectors of the FRP. In particular, First Nations consultative processes must be fully engaged with that process. What steps have been taken since this recommendation to respond to it and increase the integrative relationship between the Fraser River panel and DFO's consultative processes?
The response is written on the right-hand side, some of it there. So the making that the Fraser panel chair and the chair of FRIMP are the same person, so we bring that coordination together is a key part of this. It's also linking in other appropriate directors, understanding some of these issues and how we want to make sure we have that overall coordination. And the DFO consultation side of things is one where we've been talking here a fair amount of effort, in particular in the forum process over the last 4 years on trying to bring together the First Nations consultation into a more cohesive process. But overall, I would say there's been increasing consultations with First Nations since the last review.
There haven't been any changes to the makeup of the Fraser River panel since that review yet. Is that correct?
I'm not certain when Marcel Shepherd was the last First Nation added to the panel, and it might have been around the 04-05 period. That would be about the right timing where we would have added the third First Nation, but I'm not certain on the dates.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.